Howdy folks. Flying Circus, a tabletop RPG designed by Erica Chappelle, is the best designed game I've read in the last 5 years or so. I'd like to examine why, specifically with regard to extracting the principles that make it so brilliant, and laying them bare for you, so that you can apply those principles to designing your own game. Or, perhaps more importantly given internet discourse, to see where so many RPGs go wrong at the level of core gameplay concerns. This is not a video aimed at getting you to play Flying Circus as a player, or to run it as a GM, although you should do those things because it's very fun. This video is about analyzing what exactly makes it fun. In fact, what makes it almost impossible not to have fun while playing. This is a video, in other words, about RPG theory and what makes a compelling game. Or, at least, one model for creating a compelling game. To begin, we have to talk about the routine. Gameplay in Flying Circus is neatly divided into two separate phases. The mission, where pilots engage in, usually violent work, in their airplanes, and stress relief, where they blow all of their hard-earned money on indulging in their vices of choice. A lot of games have something like the routine. In fact, most games have something like the routine. It's simply a fancy way of dividing gameplay into combat sections and roleplay sections. The former contain most of the mechanical interfacing, and the latter contain most of the play acting. These two things are what makes playing RPGs fun. It's a crude distinction, but this imaginary divide between mechanically engaging sections and improvisationally engaging sections is characteristic of most RPGs in practice, just because of how difficult it is to multitask both rules knowledge and acting. In fact, you may have played another RPG with a similar distinction. Maybe it's the only RPG your friends are willing to play. To understand what makes the routine different from most games, we'll have to break it down into 3 steps. Step 1. Combat, here subtitled Resource Gain. Step 2. Roleplay, here subtitled Resource Expenditure. And Step 3. Reward, here subtitled Combat Prowess. An interesting thing to note about sections 1 and 2 is that they are inverted from the usual model of the adventuring day. Generally, in combat, one expends resources that are then replenished during roleplay, such as idle conversation while resting, speaking to NPCs for quest rewards, and shopping for new equipment. Flying Circus inverts this paradigm. The primary resource is gained in combat, and then spent for reward in roleplay, and one can only be rewarded with more combat prowess, internal to the game system, via this expenditure which happens outside combat. This primary resource, the one which the game is built around obtaining and the expenditure of which leads directly to reward with more combat prowess, is stress. The purpose of combat in Flying Circus is to gain stress. Playing Flying Circus in such a way as to avoid taking stress is to disengage from its systems entirely. More importantly, it's to mechanically handicap yourself from an optimizing standpoint. Shedding stress is the only way to gain experience. All other avenues of EXP gain common to role-playing games, such as killing monsters, failing rolls, and the dreaded GM fiat, are expressly discouraged, and in order to shed stress, one must first obtain it. Preferably quite a lot of it to facilitate a lot of shedding and thus a lot of EXP gain. Because stress directly generates EXP, it creates 2 profound incentive structures. Firstly, you're incentivized to gain stress in combat, including potentially playing suboptimally, in scare quotes, with regards to the encounter. This also means that the story continues seamlessly even after failure. Your pilots still gain stress, in fact potentially quite a lot more stress, and thus a lot more EXP, which they have to disperse through venting and vices regardless. Secondly, in order to gain EXP to become better at combat, you have to roleplay. There is no other way to gain experience than to participate in the creation of inter-pilot drama. The brilliance here is that min-maxing or gamist playing of characters pulls roleplay out of the person engaging in it. Optimal play of the combat portion of the game necessitates optimal play of the roleplay side of the game. And optimal play of the roleplay side of the game naturally creates drama, because losing stress can rarely be done in combat. This is compounded with the combat itself being mechanically deep in a way normally reserved for games focused entirely on the combat, such as Lancer, and lacking any incentives external to it. Returning to our 3-step schematic, it becomes easy to see why I have subtitled the sections the way I have. I know of no other games which have such a straightforward relationship between their roleplay and their reward structures. I know of very few games which guide the player's improvisation, that is to say, which give good prompts, in the way that Flying Circus does. In fact, this model of play can be easily applied to 2 games in order to improve them, one commonly played and one not so commonly played, but well written except for its reward structure. We'll begin with the first, Dungeons & Dragons. Returning to our incentive structure, we can chart it this way. Combat, subtitled Resource Gain, Roleplay, subtitled Resource Expenditure, and Reward, subtitled Combat Prowess. Dungeons & Dragons can fit this gameplay loop quite easily, with periods of adventuring, e.g. wilderness traversal, dungeon delving, other combat engagements, replacing aerial missions, and periods spent in town functioning the same as stress relief. The key difference here is that stress is not a very thematic resource to gain in dungeons. But maybe something like loot is. Loot, which can then be spent in town, which should be spent in town, to gain EXP. The need for players to find things to spend money on in order to advance can prompt all sorts of roleplay in the procurement of superior equipment, strongholds, employees, and various other aspirations. If this is sounding an awful lot like old school style of play, that's because it functionally is the old school style of play, simply systematized to ensure participation in the loop. The second game, and one near and dear to my heart, is Legend of the Five Rings 5th edition, as published by Fantasy Flight Games, prior to the jettisoning of their entire RPG department. This game suffers from a lack of incentive structure, just like Dungeons & Dragons, except here, all the other pieces are in place, just disconnected. Most scenes in L5R are court scenes, where the characters are talking with one another. Fortunately, these too are capable of being systematized, and in fact were by the book itself as intrigues. L5R even has a stress mechanic, called strife but otherwise thematically identical, and venting via unmasking. Its departures from Flying Circus are threefold. First, removing strife does not grant EXP. EXP is gained entirely by fiat, although it's suggested that players should gain 1 EXP per hour of game time. Secondly, strife decays automatically at the end of a scene, including at the end of intrigue encounters, instead of remaining until it's dealt with. Thirdly, and perhaps most importantly, unmasking carries a mechanical punishment, loss of honor, glory, or both. This creates incentives to do everything in your power to avoid unmasking, and thus incentivizes the player to avoid engaging in drama. The fixes to this are fairly simple. 1. Make it so that strife cannot be lost between scenes and reward loss of strife, or perhaps reward engaging with the unmasked ninja and Giri mechanics which govern strife specifically, with EXP. 2. Allow players to unmask in private, with friends, confidants, or other PCs at no mechanical penalty, and thereby create roleplay by forcing the characters to be vulnerable around each other. I intend to work on a court-focused game to this effect, now that I understand the structure at play. A game which is what L5R easily could have been, and one unburdened by one of the worst settings put to pen in the 90s tabletop scene. My god. In summary, an effective way to create roleplay, the goal of any TTRPG, is to mechanistically tie experience gain to that roleplay. Fiat is insufficient for this purpose, as GMs can be improperly disposed to reward their players well, for various reasons, including simple unfamiliarity. Structuring EXP gain like this will engage even mechanics-minded players in the stories and drama, by requiring their participation. Likewise, one engages narrative-focused players in the mechanical structure of the game by requiring them to literally buy drama with resources that can only be gained in combat. Structuring your game in this way provides a neat template for onboarding both types of players, and the template can be applied to any thematic EXP currency of your choice. And lastly, of course, cross the streams. Reward roleplay participation with combat effectiveness, and combat participation with drama to ensure engagement of all player types. Even very well thought out games typically sequester these two elements. Resist that impulse. Hey folks, this is the unscripted portion of the video. Thanks for watching, or more likely listening. And I just wanted to say thank you. This is my first time making anything like this at all. Not really a content creator, I don't particularly plan to become one. But this game has been consuming my mental energies for the past 2 weeks, and that's the sign that it's pretty good. Erica Chappelle is a good game designer. I'm going to link the core rulebook in the description on itch.io, where you can buy it. And otherwise, happy hunting. This particular analysis is a bit of a reduction. I didn't talk about, for instance, mastery moves. I didn't talk about some of the roleplay things that you can do in Planes, such as Discover Beauty. But I wanted to get across this very basic superstructure which underpins Flying Circus, and what makes it such a radical departure from most tabletop RPG design. I think the only other game which has had an EXP system that I've liked as much as this is Burning Wheel, but I don't enjoy playing Burning Wheel, and I don't like the philosophy underpinning it very much. It's just not to my taste. This isn't a dig at Luke Crane or anything. We can ding him for plenty of other reasons. The Flying Circus is just innovative. It's not the only game which has roleplay-focused EXP game like this by any means, but it's one that does it very well, and it's one that does it in such a raw, mechanistic fashion that you can build essentially an entire library of games just out of the central conceit of expending stress to gain EXP, or expending some other resource. Anyway, that's my little ramble to close off the video. If you liked it, please leave a like, share it on social media. Erica, if you're listening to this for whatever fucking reason, keep doing what you're doing. It's good. And tanks are definitely cooler than planes.